families. Now, nothing can be more heartbreaking than having to flee the place you've been born and brought up in. And around the world, there are millions of people who've been forced to do so. And the fear of persecution, for lots of reasons, from race to religion, has seen so many people fleeing, and they're forced to cross international and national boundaries to escape. So June 20th, this Saturday, is the day that we raise awareness about the plight of refugees around the world. And it's really held to show solidarity with those who've been displaced and really honor the resilience of refugees. And this year, the theme for 2020 is Step with Refugees. And so we want to talk today about the ways that so many of you are making a difference and taking a step with refugees around the world. So we know that every single day, major disasters, so landslides, earthquakes, floods, and crisis situations like conflict tear homes and families apart. And right now, there are more people displaced in our world than any other time in recorded history, and that's 88 million people. Now, 70 million have been displaced by force, and unfortunately, this number is only expected to rise. And so by the year 2050, it's estimated that 200 million people will be displaced worldwide. And so when we look at what that really quantifies per every minute, it's 30 people who are forced to leave everything behind every single minute to escape war, to escape persecution and terror. And there are several types of people that are forcibly displaced. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how those folks are qualified. One is a refugee. And a refugee is someone who's fled their home and country, owning really to a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership in a particular social group or political opinion. And many refugees are in exile to escape the effects of disasters, whether that's natural or human-made disasters. The second type of group that we talk about are asylum seekers. And this is a group that says they're refugees and have fled their homes as refugees do, but their claim to refugee status is not yet definitively evaluated in the country to where they fled. The other type we're going to talk about are internally displaced persons, so IDPs. And these are people who've not crossed an international border, but have moved to a different region than the one they call home within their home country. And then other groups we refer to as stateless persons, and these are people who do not have a recognized nationality and don't belong to any one country. And then returnees, and these are former refugees who return to their own country or regions of origin after a time in exile. So at least roughly 71 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes today, and among them, 30 million are classified as refugees. And over half of these are children. They're under the age of 18. So when we look at those that are particularly vulnerable, I want to draw out women and children, because 75% of the people displaced in our world today are women and children. And as women around the world flee violence and face disasters, they're often left homeless, they're less particularly vulnerable, and they experience higher death rates, higher rates of gender-based violence, higher economic loss, and loss of education. However, with all those particular disparities and vulnerabilities, women are pivotal in the recovery process. They're often first responders in crisis, and they play a central role in the survival and the resilience of their families and their communities. And this is a particular group that ShelterBox really works to reach and really help enable the self-recovery of women each year, delivering shelter and supporting them as they enable the recoveries of their community. Now, women also face female challenges due to displacement, the most common being gender-based violence. And women and girls are forced to move from their homes and communities, and often they're at greater risk of sexual assault and physical abuse. Young, unaccompanied women, as well as single female-headed households, seem to be particularly vulnerable. So, with a very deep concern about widespread violations of rights of refugees and displaced, ShelterBox is specifically working to help a lot of vulnerable groups, and that includes women and children. And we recognize the important role that they play, and we really work to tailor a lot of our programs accordingly to help a lot of the special populations that we're serving. So an obvious question is how, at ShelterBox are we helping these families, and how are we helping the wider refugee community? And we're really doing it by providing access to one of the basic needs all of us have, and that's access to shelter and then other essential household items that really are critical to setting up household for families. So one thing we know at ShelterBox is that shelter is so much more than a roof. It's protection from the cold, the rain, the sun, from disease. It's the foundation for life and for family and for community. And I think especially during COVID, I would imagine all of us can really understand the importance that shelter plays to our safety and well-being. And it's so critical that families have access to shelter as part of the long road to recovery when they've lost their shelter or when they've been forced to flee their home. So looking at some of the ShelterBox aid and equipment, many of you will be familiar with the classic ShelterBox. We've been distributing ShelterBoxes for 20 years, and the basic premise for when we started the organization was really, what are the basic essentials that people need? What are the things that you need if you've lost your home and you're forced to flee in an instant? And the center of gravity is a tent. And this is an example of the family emergency tent that is included within a ShelterBox. And that will be the place that a family calls home when they've lost their home in an emergency or in a conflict. Now, I know this looks like a recreation tent. It is not. This is meant for humanitarian purposes. It will be a place that they call home. This is an example of a double-walled tent that ShelterBox provides. It's one of several different types of shelter aid items that you're going to see today. The other things that we think about, obviously food, feeding. So while we don't provide food, other aid organizations do that. We provide the materials to prepare and serve a hot meal, to boil water. So you see stainless steel cooking equipment, really, really essential household aid item. You've often lost power, so we provide solar lanterns. Contamination of the water source is very common in these situations, so we provide access to a water purification unit, containers to store purified water, mosquito nets to prevent vector-borne diseases, and then basic things like blankets, ground mats, tool sets. So often people are literally digging out with their bare hands, or they need to make repairs on their shelter. So basic tools and instruments to really help with that recovery process. Now, there are a variety of different tents, really based on the geography, based on the environmental situation. Are we working in an area of civil unrest? So different types of aid items. Often in a refugee setting, we're providing the one in the bottom right corner, which is what's called a UN spec tent. However, we also provide in many of these refugee situations, and when we're working with IDPs, we also provide a variety of different types of tools and aid items. This is an example of a shelter toolkit. This is a shelter kit which can be used to provide the basic framing and the basic tools from this kit to create a single room structure or repair a tent or repair a home that's been damaged. And we often provide these in many of the areas that we're working around the world with refugees. And there's an infinite number of ways that that can be used. This is actually one example of one of the shelter kits and the tarpaulins that you see here. I want to introduce you to several stories today, and I want to talk about the journey and the road to recovery for many refugees. And the first I want to share with you is one of the beneficiaries who received ShelterBox aid, and her name is Fatima. She was born in Nigeria. She's 37 years old, and she now makes the Minowal refugee camp in Cameroon her home with her two children, Aisha and Burka. Now she shares this Minowal camp with tens of thousands of families who, like her, have fled to Cameroon to escape the violent attacks by an extremist group called Boko Haram. Now, before coming to the Minowal camp, she lived with her husband and children and her mother and her cousin. But they escaped when the violent extremists stormed her village, and she lost her mother and her cousin during the attacks, and she ran with her family. They lost absolutely everything. She said that they didn't have time to take anything with them. She was alone with her children and with no support because her husband was captured and arrested. Now, she dreams of being able to see her husband again, but she has made the Minowal camp her safe haven and her place to call home. And this is a really important place that ShelterBox is working. We work both with new refugees to the camp, where ShelterBox is the only provider of tents to new arrivals to the camp. And we also work with refugees who've made the Minowal camp their home for years and provide basic household items as well as things like tarpaulins and tools to help them create and enable their recovery through the development of their home site. This is another picture of Fatima, and you can see basic things that we're providing, from cooking equipment to tarpaulins to tents, to help them rebuild their lives within the camp. So leaving home, we want to walk you through, and I hope to share with you what the walk is like for a journey for a refugee, from the decision to leave, the journey to safety, arriving at a camp, and starting your life all over again. And for many of these folks, like Fatima, they will live a generation in this camp. So everyone's story is different, and the journey is told from many different perspectives. But these are people who are now living in the Minowal camp in Cameroon. So to give you a little perspective on the Lake Chad Basin of Africa, and this is where Cameroon is. It's these countries that are darkened in green. So it's Cameroon, it's Chad, it's Niger, and it's Nigeria. And the history of the area is really important because it helps to shape the narrative around what families have really experienced and what they're facing. So the area around that lake, it's called Lake Chad. It's a freshwater lake. It's located where Chad and Nigeria, Cameroon and Niger meet. So you see it's right there in the middle. And it used to be one of the largest lakes in Africa. It provided water for 30 million people. But since the 1960s, the lake has shrunk by a lot. It's estimated at 90%, turning the area largely into a desert. And it once was a very lucrative area where people relied on the lake for their livelihoods, and they lived with plentiful fish on a very fertile land. But that definitely has changed over the decades. And this area now in the Lake Chad Basin has some of the poorest people on the planet. So when you look on the Human Development Index, places like Niger, like Chad, these folks are experiencing extreme poverty, massive underdevelopment. They are facing climate change and many factors with growing insecurity, which includes violent extremist groups like Boko Haram attacks, which has forced millions of people to flee. Now, this is a huge, complex humanitarian crisis. It has many causes, and it's left millions of people displaced in its wake. So I'm going to focus in on Cameroon. It's an area that we've been working for years. I want to share with you a Google Earth image of a desert in Cameroon. This is from December of 2013. And what's happened in the interceding months and years is pretty incredible. So as you can see, as I built this slide, you're going to see these little white dots. Now, all of these dots are tents. And these are all Nigerian refugees who have been forced to flee to the camp. The camp was originally set up for 20,000 people, but now nearly 70,000 people. You can see those are all ShelterBox tents. In just 2 years' time, the tents fill the entire screen. And these are all families that we are supporting with shelter and then other aid items from tarpaulins, kitchen sets, mosquito nets, water purifiers, solar lights. And these are families who are some of the most vulnerable families in our world today, like Fatima, who I shared with you. I want to talk to you about another family that we've helped during our time working in Cameroon. This is Lydia, and she's 30 years old. She's a mother of 3, and she also was living with her husband near the Nigeria-Cameroon border. They were farmers, life was not easy, and they struggled every day to feed and take care of their children. But as Lydia told us, they were happy. But everything changed one day when Boko Haram stormed her village, and all she could do was hide. And for several days, she remained hidden with her children until one day they were found, and Boko Haram captured Lydia's husband. And when the attackers left, she escaped with her children. And separated from her husband, Lydia knew that with Boko Haram in her village, she had to flee. She had no choice, or her children likely would not have survived. So she made her way into Cameroon, and she went to the Minowao camp. And she says her first days were really hard. She cried for her husband, and she lived in constant fear for her children. But Lydia was eventually relocated, and like most new arrivals, they are living in overcrowded collective centers as they're processed, their transit centers, as they're processed into the camp. So she was relocated, as you can see, to a ShelterBox tent. And she said, and this is her direct quote, "I can now sleep knowing that my children are by my side and there's no risk of losing them. This tent provides us with protection from the rain and the sun, and we have light at night and cover when we sleep, and now have items to cook our food with." Thank you very much. And so often we receive thanks from the people that we're serving. And I know there's so many people on this webinar today who've made this life-saving work possible and who've made this work, including shelter to families like Lydia over the past year, possible. So we want to thank all of you. The refugee journey is physically exhausting, and we hear that time and time again. But it's also really emotionally exhausting to leave everything that you know and leave everything behind and have to travel to a new country and make that new place your home. And one of the women that is very near and dear to my heart is a woman by the name of Esther. And Esther is indicative of the families that we are working to find every day and support. Now, Esther, in 2014, she was a teenager. She was living in a place called Boko, Nigeria, when her village was attacked. And so unfortunately, Esther's situation is not uncommon, but she has a particularly horrific one. She was with her family in her home, and her father was brutally murdered. Her mother was raped and murdered, and her 3 brothers were also murdered that night. And they told Esther to run, and likely she was going to be target practice. But Esther made it with other girls to the border of Cameroon. She ran to the border, and she was taken at that point by a group of security forces who she said she feared so much of. But they brought her to a place, again, called the Minowao camp, which is over the border into Cameroon. It was a long journey for anyone to take, but it was the only chance that she had for survival. And so I want to share with you, Esther has made Minowao camp her home since 2014. And she has really transformed her life in the camp. One of the major things that transformed her life was a sewing class. Within the Minowao camp, she received training as a seamstress. She has become one of the best seamstresses in her block of the camp, and she is now earning a living again. In addition, she's been married in the camp, and she has 2 young children who you see there. that she supports through her life as a seamstress. So this again is an example of one of the families in the past year that we've supported with tarpaulins, with basic kitchen sets, lights, blankets for her family to really help enable her self-recovery. And it's likely that Esther and her family will be living in Minnow Camp for many more years. And she is making a life there. So arriving to the camp can also be a mixture of emotions. We hear that, finally, when you reach a camp like Minnow, it's a safe place for you to flee the violence. But when you arrive, you face scarce resources and you have a whole host of new challenges. So again, there are lots of processes and protocols in place when families arrive. Typically, when you arrive, you are in a transit center, and you can be in a transit center, also known as a collective center, for many weeks. Now, we've heard that these are particularly difficult during COVID because there's no opportunity to self-isolate or social distance. But another example of a person that we've supported, a family we've supported in the camp, is Teshmaya. And he made it to the Minnow camp, but his journey to recovery didn't end there. Upon arrival, he had to stay in the collective center for many months. And he shared with us that the first weeks were not easy for his family, especially in this transit center. He said that he never imagined that they would be able to survive in such an environment. He said he had nothing. He had access to little resources and really no space of his own. However, after several weeks, Teshmaya eventually was able to receive shelter and a private space to call his own. And I wanted to share one of the 8 items that he most appreciated from us was actually what's in his hand, which is a water purification unit. And the importance of clean water and to being able to maintain good health and good hygiene was particularly important to him and his family. Again, basic items, but so essential and life-saving to the families that receive these items. So adjusting to life in these camps is also very, very difficult. I'm going to share with you another story, and this is 25-year-old Modu. She's originally from Nigeria, and she worked as a trader and lived with her husband and 4 children. And she said that they were united and very happy before the attacks happened. But she said that they had to run to save their lives. The whole village had been completely destroyed where she lived by Boko Haram. And she ran with her children. And unfortunately, it's another story where she never saw her husband again. She now cares for her children on her own. And she said that she lives in the hope that she will one day see them again. So weeks after fleeing, Modu and her children made it to the Minnow camp. The first days were, again, very difficult in the transit center and not easy. She said it was very difficult to sleep at night. It was overcrowded, and they lived in a very narrow space. But Modu has received a ShelterBox tent, and her quote to us was, "Since then, my life has become so much better. I miss my husband, but I feel deeply relieved. We finally have privacy, and we have our own place to call home." She said she's made some new friends in the camp who are also refugees and who've shared very similar experiences to hers. And she said that the tent gives them a space to talk in private and to be able to connect as a family. So again, I think it's so critical that we're able to provide the basic essential items to some very vulnerable people in the world. All of these folks are refugees. And as we work to really commemorate this Saturday, World Refugee Day, I hope that you'll remember some of these stories, Modu and Fatima and Esther. And we do a lot of monitoring and evaluation for all of our work. It's really critical that we collect data, that we understand the impact that we're having on these families and on these communities. And I do want to share with you that based on the monitoring and evaluation and learning data that we received from this camp specifically, the Minnow camp in Cameroon, 100% of the respondents interviewed agreed that they've had improved levels of family privacy after receiving ShelterBox tents and ShelterBox shelter kits and aid items. And so that's really, really important for us to understand and collect and monitor the impact that we're having. Now, moving forward, many refugees hope to return home. They hope to be a returnee. But with continued instability in their home communities, the return to get back is often far off and often many, many years away. So families have to find a way to move forward, often while remaining right where they are. So I'm going to share with you another story. Also, her name is Esther. She lived in Nigeria, where she was a farmer, and she decided to use her skills to make money so her children could eat. And she found other women who also knew about farming, and they had said the conditions were not great, and there was no soil available for refugees inside the camp. But there were people in nearby villages who were able to rent them some soil. So she didn't have enough money to start growing. So she started collecting wood to sell until she could collect enough money to rent some soil so she could start growing her crops. And growing her crops, she did. It wasn't long before she started to grow. And what she used to do in her village, she grew millet, groundnuts, and maize. And these were things that she liked to eat. And she knew how to use, how to really plant seed and how to work with a hoe and a machete and a rake. And so right now, Esther is farming again. And after every harvest, she divides her crops into two, one for her family and one for sale. And when she harvests them, she uses them for food for her family and she cooks with it. But she also uses the sale to make some money to help take care of her children, to buy clothing and to help with treatment when they're sick. And this has really, really been able to help provide and enable her self-recovery, is helping her get back to work again. And that's one of the things that shelter helps enable and provide, that when people have a place to call home, when refugees can begin the process of recovery, when they have a roof over their head, they have basic things like light and cooking equipment, they can start to go out and earn a living and start to enable the recovery of their family. So she says, and this is her quote, "I'm happy growing plants. It helps my family, and we are not as dependent as we used to be." Now, everyone's story is so different, and I know I've shared some stories of resilience and of strength, particularly stories from the Lake Chad Basin, and I wanted to draw your attention to one area of the world that I think it's called the forgotten crisis, and because it doesn't make the headlines, there's very little charitable support for this work, and it's so life-saving to these families. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about Lake Chad Basin, but I would be very remiss if I did not draw your attention to one other critical area of the world that have had some of the largest displacement numbers of both refugees and IDPs over the past 10 years, and that area is Syria. I want to draw your attention to be what is one of the largest forcibly displaced populations in the world. It now is over 13 million people displaced, more than half of the pre-war population of Syria. Now, and I also want to draw your attention that with the arrival of COVID-19, the need for humanitarian support around our world is greater than ever, but particularly significant in places like Syria. So we've been working in Syria since 2012. We've had a long-term commitment. It doesn't make the headlines, but this work is truly life-saving to the internally displaced people in Syria, as well as the refugees who fled the country. And there's been a particular increase and resurgence of displacement even since December of 2019, when nearly 1 million people were forced to flee the Idlib province in northwestern Syria. Lots of airstrikes, ground attacks, and it caused a massive amount of displacement. As you can see, we've got ShelterBox aid going into this camp here. We do a lot of work in Syria, everything from tents to tarps to blankets, children's clothing, cooking equipment, and we have been working in the Syrian refugee crisis since 2012 and have provided shelter to over 250,000 people. Again, it doesn't often make the headlines, but it is the reason why in 2018 and in 2019, ShelterBox was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for our work in cutting through the chaos and bringing shelter and basic supplies to some of these families. We work with distribution partners in this region. In this instance, we're working with an organization called Relief Aid, and we're really trying to help people really just manage through one of the worst crisis situations of our entire generation. So I want to show you one of these families, and this is And is one of the families, one of the thousands who've recently lost their home in Syria as this conflict enters its 10th year. And this is what she shared with our partners. We were living in the village and 2 rockets fell next to us. We fled our house and we took refuge in a cave. My children were crying and the situation was so scary. We left the village quickly and we went north and we moved from one area to another and we could not find a place to live. We had 2 houses with many possessions in addition to agricultural land, but we had to leave without taking anything with us except for the clothes that we had. We've not been able to return yet. Now, shares that life is hard. Everyone lives in a very small tent and everything we do is in our tent. It's where we wash our clothes, where we eat, and the situation is not easy. My children are always in the tent so that they can stay warm and not go outside to prevent them from getting sick. We have not had enough blankets to keep warm, and we use our clothes and everything we have to just stay alive. Now, again, is very indicative of the people that we work to support, and Syria is one place that in the winter months, particularly this past winter, was very cold there. We do a lot of children's thermal gear and onesies and extra blankets because this is an area of extremes, very hot, dusty summers, very cold winters. And I want to thank, there are many of you on the line today that have helped ShelterBox provide the aid materials for the winter months. Everything from blankets and mattresses to water containers, lighting, tarpaulin, and this again doesn't often make the headlines. It doesn't generate a lot of charitable support, but for those of you who leaned in, this was really life-saving to the families, the internally displaced families that we were supporting. Now, had said, and this is what she wanted to share, we don't want to be displaced again because we've been displaced so many times and have suffered so much. We will work to collect some money to replace our tent with a stone building to live in and to begin life again with our children going to school is what I dream of. Again, I think this has been incredibly difficult over the years in Syria. It seemingly has gotten worse each and every year, and we've had a long-term commitment to supporting these families. But I will tell you, COVID-19 has only added another disaster on top of a horrific humanitarian crisis situation. And so at ShelterBox, we have only continued to adapt and scale our work in light of COVID, and it has not been easy. But shelter, healthcare, hygiene are the 3 mitigating factors to mitigating the spread of this virus. Now, shelter is what we're leaning in on, but we've also been increasing our aid materials beyond just shelter. But we know enabling families to move from collective centers, from transit centers into individual shelters where they can self-isolate, they can social distance, they can have better conditions to maintain their health and hygiene is absolutely critical. So I want to share with you some of the things that we're doing to really help mitigate the spread. So our tents and shelter kits absolutely help keep distance for families. Emergency shelter is vital, and we are going to continue to increase the tents, the shelter kits, and the provision of basic shelter to help families have a safe space to shelter during this crisis situation. However, we've also been adapting our aid to include things beyond just the tents and the other household items that I familiarized you with. We're also including custom aid packages to support good hygiene. So in Syria, some of our measures include we're adding soap and hand washing basins. We're adding educational materials. So we have a health worker present during our aid distributions. So people have the education as well as the main materials to not just social distance, but maintain better hygiene during this time. It is so, so critical. Now, in addition, we want to help promote better health. There are certain aid items that definitely help to do that. Cooking equipment. So we don't want people necessarily sharing in villages. We want them to have their own individual cook sets. You want to have your own sleep mats, your own water filters, your own water containers. So we're making sure that we help families stay healthy and reduce the spread of infection by providing individual custom sets. This is especially important in crowded settlements. And so we are working to increase the aid materials in a variety of different ways, but we're also adapting in some different ways as well. So we are really adapting our distributions. We're having smaller distribution days. We're ensuring that we have smaller groups of people to receive aid items. We're encouraging social distances. We're using PPE. So all of our distribution partners are using masks, gloves, sanitizers. They're sanitizing surfaces, or making sure our beneficiaries maintain a minimum of 6 feet in the distributions as well. Critically important. Now, our aid has not stopped. We continue to respond to both conflict situations as well as disasters. And I wanted to give you and show you a picture of some of the local work that we're doing in the Philippines. And we're distributing shelter kits, nails, ropes, mosquito nets, solar lights, and we're helping families who've been displaced by the Taal volcano when it erupted earlier this year. We're working with our Rotary partners there to really help provide the essential aid items during, what is also a very big crisis with COVID there. So I wanted to show you some of the examples. We've recently responded in the Philippines there, and some of the work was to the Taal volcano. Other work that we were working in was to help some of the healthcare providers and some of the health facilities with shelter kits that we provided. So they have triage centers to help with some of the COVID patients that they're seeing. So this is one of my last images to show you. And this was showing how we're modifying our distribution practices. And we are working alongside a long-term partner that we have, which is Rotary in the Philippines. And as Rotarians, they are people of action. And they told us that the COVID crisis presented a massive challenge for them. But with all the difficulties, we're finding ways to deliver the aid to communities whatever way that we can. And so the work has become, as you can imagine, deeply complex, but it's never been as important as it is right now. So as we mark this World Refugee Day this Saturday, in the midst of a dramatic social change, a pandemic that has without a doubt tested our strength, and it's highlighted systematic inequalities in our world. It's also a time that's connected us in new ways. And for us, during COVID, during this World Refugee Day this week, we want to recognize, we want to raise awareness of particular groups, refugees, IDPs, who are on the front lines fighting this pandemic, who are struggling to survive, and really highlight all the good work and all of our supporters who are really helping to reach these families and help enable their recovery of some of the most vulnerable people in our world. Now, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, pandemic or not, every single one of us can make a difference, and every single action counts. And all of us are taking so many steps with refugees. And so I want to just share with you in a final note before I take a few questions. that ShelterBox is now in our 20th year of our work. And a huge piece of our work is in crisis and conflict situations, supporting refugees. Since we started in 2000, we have brought shelter to 1.5 million people. It's over 300 deployments across the world in over 100 countries. And in so many ways, I feel like our work is only beginning. The need for our work has never been greater, and we are going to do everything we can to continue to stand and take steps with refugees and help some of the most vulnerable people in our world today. So I know there are many questions, and I want to thank you for your time here today. A few questions. How can we help? There are so many ways to help. From serving as volunteers to making a financial contribution to ShelterBox, you can go on our website at shelterboxusa.org. Many of the projects I talked about today, from our work in COVID to the projects in Syria, are desperate need of funding for, and there are many ways to lean in and help get involved in many of these projects. So if you want, please go to ShelterBox USA to learn about volunteerism, to learn about our work with our ambassadors and becoming response team members, as well as how to make a contribution. There are many questions around, are we still responding to natural disasters during COVID? And the answer is yes. We are doing a lot of work. Right now, we had aid that just arrived with the help of our partner, Latter-day Saints Charities. We're working in Vanuatu. Cyclone Harold, a Category 5 cyclone, devastating the northern provinces of Vanuatu. And yes, we are sending aid in. Our shelter kits and our household items have arrived in Port Vila this week, and we are thrilled to be working with a partner on the ground that is going to be distributing these aid items and shelter to the families. So yes, all of our work continues. So I want to just say a big thank you to all of you for participating today. I'm putting my email on this slide. It's kmurray@shelterboxusa.org. I would love to hear from you. I want to say a huge thank you. So often we receive thanks from our beneficiaries, but it is truly all of you who deserve thanks for this life-saving work. Never has our work been more important, and we are so grateful for all of your support and for your time today to learn more about the refugee crisis facing our world and the ways that ShelterBox is working to help refugees. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your participation in this organization, and we are so grateful that you are joining us today. So thank you so much, and if you have questions, please reach out.